I think the questions that we need to ask as people are, what is this going to do for my life? Like, who cares about a bunch of like ex hedge fund guys like myself? When at the end of it, we got wild technology we'd never heard of. There's going to be a lot of creative destruction and things will boom, bust, fail, succeed. And coming out at the end of it, we'll have clarity. But the only clarity we have now is that we don't have clarity.
When people compare AI against humans, well, AI you can measure very specifically, against particular benchmarks and so forth. But humans, you cannot. Humans, I think, on a bell curve. That means it's a very, very different situation. So it's very difficult. That makes it, I think, extremely difficult in a meaningful way to make statements, AI is better or not.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of WIT, which is What I Think. We're here with Robert Blin and Klaus Nemzau from Project Ned. Robert and Klaus are partners there. Robert specializes in finance, and Klaus is specializing in strategic growth.
Right.
Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Well, we're going to jump right into it. I want to hear what Project Ned is about, and then we're going to then talk about artificial intelligence. So, Robert?
Sure. Happy to start. Thanks for the opportunity. So we're a consultancy shop. And one of the things that we do is focus on companies who are developing AI-based solutions. Anybody in venture, anybody in those spaces is always focused on products that have very high sort of gross margins. And that's why software ate the world ever since it began in California. And now I think what we're seeing is a step function where AI is software accelerating software instead of humans accelerating software. So predictably, what you're seeing is high levels of interest from the venture community. One of the things that we're doing is, we're not just working with companies that themselves are doing AI solutions. AI tools are the backbone of our workflow and the way that we provide answers, clarity, materials to help companies market themselves. So in my workflow, and especially in our other partner, John's workflow, AI is a large backbone and it lets us do, I guess it's maybe hyperbole, but it lets us do the work of many men with one man and a couple of silicone chips.
Wow, amazing. So productivity must be going through the roof.
Sadly, the downside of that is that you still work just as hard.
Sounds about right. And Klaus, I want to hear what you know a little bit more from you and what you're doing at Project Net as well.
Yeah, so I joined Project Net about 6 months ago, I think. And I'm based in Singapore. And I focus on Asia, so Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, and many other countries in the region. And I'm trying to find sort of candidate companies that are at the stage they would be able to benefit from what Net can offer, which is access to US capital markets, potential exit, IPO, and so forth in the US. And I find companies that don't have those skills or think they don't have that skills and know-how. And I must say that's kind of the hypothesis, that we find companies in Asia that could really benefit from that. They might reach kind of a ceiling in terms of traditional fundraising and want to expand from here. And so far, we actually found a number of really interesting candidates, Singapore and Korea in particular. So that's what I'm doing. I'm helping from an Asia perspective out of Singapore.
What criteria are you looking at, Klaus, in terms of potential companies that might benefit from the strategic services that you offer?
Companies that are not super early stage. So those that have some customer traction, some good revenues already, and have some reputation regionally, I would say is one criterion. Another one, that what they do can be extended to the US and other parts. Many things can, particular sort of infrastructure plays, but certain things are, perhaps very specific to a situation in the Philippines or so that, would be difficult to transfer outside, the region and in the US. And another aspect is that we like sort of technology companies that work with deep tech things, and often, infrastructure, not purely consumer focused. That's kind of, I think, where we have so far some good traction. Rob, you might want to.
Oh, no, you took my point. So well done. I think what we're seeing is one of the things that changed the way the markets function in the last 50 years or so was agglomeration of power or influence or eyeballs. It's become a winner take all market. And that's why we've seen, you pick it, FANG or the Magnificent Seven, just rip the face off of everything else in the stock market. In the old days, you said, well, I'm going to pick an underdog. And now once you have a network effect at scale, the underdogs just don't win unless there's a paradigm change or some profound improvement in an underlying technology. So I think from our perspective, extensibility is vastly important, because when you think about training data and our previous generation, which was, the social networks, the more you have, the faster you grow, the smarter you get.
For those who don't know, the FANG stocks are like the top stocks: Facebook, Netflix, Google. What's the A?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Amazon.
Amazon, of course, right. And yeah, so for the little people, I'm sure there's lots of hurdles and leaps, and even if it's a good technology or a good team, then they can fail quite quickly, run out of money, not know what to do
Right.
next, not pivot quickly. That's where you guys come in, right? When you guys work with them as well and add in
Sure.
a lot of connections, potentially introductions and
Yeah,
experience.
that's definitely our other partner, Jonathan, has the most experience in the space. But from our perspective, when you're a company and you're growing, you're hungry for cash flow one way or the other. And you can either be, losing money or you can be making more revenue and you could have equity in or you could have sales. So from our perspective, whether we feed somebody a promising investor or a promising sales lead's going to be less expensive for the company in terms of, the owner keeping their share. So that's where Klaus comes in.
And I think also, I mean, we're not looking for companies that are ready for IPO tomorrow. I mean, that would be nice too, but often for companies that we think and the company and the investors actually also think that they could be ready for an IPO, say in 18 to 24 months. But what we don't want to wait until they're at that stage, but we want to engage with them very early to make sure that in many different dimensions, they're ready for an IPO within the time frame. And that does include introducing them to, perhaps to potential underwriters, investment banks, might be able to introduce them to people that can give them a bridge financing round, but also in terms of governance, obviously the whole financial side, but also, what do IPO investors in the US expect from a company? Certain things might be in place already, others could be added in terms of additional maybe product offering. And so there's many dimensions, but the important thing is we want to work with them ideally way before the IPO so we can gently make sure that everything is in place for that.
Certainly, that 18 to 24 months sounds like a long time, but it's not a long time.
Very true.
Does that mean then, let's say there's a company that maybe their technology is not appropriate for an IPO? Are there other exit strategies as well that you guys look at, or is it mainly the IPO?
It's a profound and important question. Everything in finance is sort of time value of money, right? Just like you would, have a savings bond and you get more money in the future, you pay a certain amount today. That's interest, that's the cost of capital. So depending upon the company, depending upon the founder's desires, are something that I think we have to get very, very close to. Going through the process of becoming a public company, it changes your job description. So as a CEO of a public company, you're not just responsible for your employees and your customers. Suddenly you become responsible for your investors. So I think that there are certain founders that are, totally happy with that. Like it's okay that I go on a conference circuit and that I'm accountable 4 times a year to shareholder expectations. That may not be everyone. I think in terms of messaging from a company, if a company says, oh, we're just out here and we're looking to be acquired, if you were to think about that, they're making themselves appear less desirable or less ambitious. So the statement that I'm looking to be acquired may have a negative implication on whatever that valuation will be. Whereas if they boldly say, hey, we're ready to take over the world, and they will end up getting acquired along the way, great. Hopefully for everyone. They don't lose anything by putting themselves on the path to maximizing value, even if that's not their own plan.
Amazing. Well, yeah, I mean, trying to extract that is definitely, I'm sure, not easy. Can I ask you guys, I'm sure there's many people who are out there, well, like, where do I even begin? Because there's probably these guys that are hackathons and they're just serial hackers. They're full of great ideas and stuff like that. And then they get to a certain stage and like, oh, I actually have something here. Like, how do they find people like you?
I mean, I've been over the last sort of 11 years now that I've been in Singapore, and before that, it's more than 7 years in Hong Kong. I've been involved with technology and startups in many different ways. So I've been running, I've ran accelerators in the maritime space. We brought in 25 companies, which means we looked at hundreds. So I've been sort of through these different jobs that I had deeply involved with networking, particularly in Singapore and Hong Kong. So that means I have early access to, these early stage startups. I see them growing over the years. Literally, I've seen companies that started with one and now, have a running business. I've been also involved with a lot of the investors, the VCs, the later stage investors, some of the government agencies, particularly in Singapore, that help the whole startup ecosystem. This week, I'm at the Singapore Maritime Week, for example, which is very intense. A lot of people coming from around the world. So I think that basically gives me sort of good access. Sometimes people come. Now it's a little bit more tricky. It's easier in some ways to find the very early stage companies. And I would think, that people that are passionate about an idea and have some, good co-founder team and technology, they can get funding. But it's a little bit more difficult to find sort of the later stage company because obviously, there's sort of a fallout between, the many early stage companies and how many get to the later stages.
Right. They kind of outgrow certain relationships as well and need new ones. And you guys are, I mean, it seems like you guys are quite internationally based, right? I know you, Klaus, you mentioned you lived in Hong Kong for a number of years and then also Singapore. And well, how about you, Robert? I don't know.
This is New York. That's why it's dark back there. I was born in Panama and I went to grade school in Hong Kong and then Nebraska and then New York. So Nebraska was the weirdest post of all.
Yeah. What was up in Nebraska?
I have father's family. I left as quickly as I could. No offense to the state.
Before Hong Kong, I lived in New York also for, I think, like 8 years or so, and in London for 12 years, and in Switzerland. So I have sort of some good idea, I think, about what, people, investors and so forth from those regions, how they think and expect. I mean, it's difficult to generalize, but generally have some sensibility, I think, for different approaches and different points of views.
Yeah, well, you guys got all bases covered, it sounds like. I feel that way because, I was from New York and I'm from a very small town, Robert. My eyes certainly opened up in interacting with different people from different countries and seeing firsthand what people are like, essentially. Let's really dive more into AI. Well, I always ask my interviewees what their definition of artificial intelligence is, but I'd love to hear you guys quickly mention what that is. And then, what in this field are you really seeing pop up? What's hot?
It's an interesting question, and I would not claim to have the answer. But when I was working in Zurich in the 1980s with Accenture, we were not really building, but we were looking and implementing for our clients so-called expert systems, rule-based expert systems, programming language like Lisp, I remember. And that was kind of the idea of AI at the time, which wasn't really much more than some, beefed up what-if statements kind of thing. And then when I was at BP, we followed the AI, very closely. Those were, for example, there was one Beyond Limits, a company that was developing, I think, in JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the AI they used on the Mars rover. And then I was involved actually with Jonathan to introduce that to BP, and they started investing, doing prototypes and so forth. So that was kind of, the AI at the time. And then, of course, the biggest thing, truly, I think that's been happening over the last couple of years, since when is it, 2022, is Gen AI and, the different generations of that. And I've seen things in IT sort of from the 70s and 80s. And this thing, has blew my mind when I first saw it. And so it's hard to, I don't know if you need to have a definition, when you see it kind of thing. But I think what we're seeing now with Gen AI and the different flavors, I think that certainly is AI and where it's going and how quickly it's developing. That's kind of my impression of it.
Great answer. Yeah, the classic is obviously the Turing test, and we can keep arguing about whether that's being passed now or not. From my perspective, it's basically passed. The other way I think that you could look at it is, can you reverse the system? So right now, we don't fully understand the human mind, and it does really interesting things. And I think the place we are with transformers right now is headed pretty rapidly into black box territory, where, the person built the thing and it's giving these outputs that seem really interesting, but you can't reverse engineer the process, that it's nonlinear, it's iterative, it's recursive. And I think that's pretty interesting in terms of thinking about what makes animal intelligence special. And there are traits around that I think are emerging in these emergent systems.
The other thing that sort of comes to mind is when people compare AI against humans. Well, AI you can measure very specifically, against particular benchmarks and so forth. But humans, you cannot. Humans, I think, on a bell curve. That means it's a very, very different situation, because some most, smarter people, perhaps still smarter than AI in certain areas, but, that means all the non-PhD people, already have been surpassed by AI in many ways. So that's kind of really, humans are in a very different situation. Some are specialized, certain PhD topics. Most other people outside the field just simply don't understand at all. So it's very difficult. That makes it, I think, extremely difficult in a meaningful way to make statements, AI is better or not, and Turing test included.
Yeah, it really isn't measurable. What I'm finding more and more is too, there's different types of intelligence. Even building relationships and commonality and things like that are, where's that in the equation essentially?
What blew my mind recently is, so I used the advanced voice mode of ChatGPT. So, talk to her in different ways. And I said, hey, can we speak in German? And she spoke, it's a female voice I'm using there, I call her Lily. She spoke standard German. And then I said, can you speak with a Bavarian accent? And then it switched into a Bavarian accent. It was pretty amazing. And then I said, can you speak it's called Plattdeutsch, which is a German language that is probably dead by now. It was spoken by my grandmother in the north of Germany. And otherwise, I don't know any living speakers of this language. And then lo and behold, then this thing started speaking like my grandmother in this, language. And then I asked her, that's amazing. Can you tell me some of the grammatical differences between Plattdeutsch and Standard German? And then it started explaining the grammatical difference. So I don't even know where it's coming from, but it was spooky.
Whoa. And sort of just kind of almost like talking to your grandmother again. I'm sure it brought back memories.
In fact, that's one of my projects that I plan to do. So I have hundreds of handwritten pages of grandmother's diaries. And at that point, it was pre-TikTok. People could actually even, not very highly educated people could write full sentences and, really interesting stuff. And then my father in the 80s, when grandma couldn't see much more anymore, he gave her this Sony tape cassette recorders. And then she recorded dozens of hours of oral history. So my plan is, I think with today's technology, I will get that transcribed. I will use something like 11 Lab to clone her voice, because I have all these voice recordings, and feed that into some kind of a custom GPT. And then I'll be able to converse, like in Black Mirror, I'll be able to converse with grandmother about anything that is interesting.
Wow. Yeah, I almost feel like I need a philosophical degree as well. I'd like to add that to my further studies. I have a question for you guys. This may be on the website, but why is it called Project Ned?
Names are a difficult thing. In this case, the implication was that we had several different letters that could match each of the NED, and that they were to some extent discarded. The reason NED was chosen was actually because of Ned Stark from Game of Thrones. That was not my choice, but there was genesis in that, and then reverse engineering of what NED could stand for, but left alone as a cipher or a mystery.
Ned Stark, and he's the one that that's not the Red
He
Wedding.
dies in episode 1, so we clearly had
Oh.
good ambitions for our company.
Right, but he kind of led the moral high ground in a way.
Correct.
And
That's exactly right.
he's
And then
kinda-
catalyzed all of the events that followed. Mhm.
Yeah, like okay, wow, now I get it. Now I get it. There's a level of purpose in a way, and
Certainly.
morality, yeah, to all of this then, which is I think that's fascinating. This is you have to do good. That's
One
what
would hope.
the Starks had always done, was be that kind of like model, and then navigating all the other kingdoms which weren't so nice, like the Lannisters or something.
You got
I'm
it.
sure that happens a lot in Silicon Valley, and going IPO is navigating that, huh?
Unquestionably. Yeah, finance is cutthroat.
You guys have any stories about that, like things that have happened or certain projects that you could share about, like taking a company from a certain stage to where it needs to be?
When I was at Shazam, I was one of the early angel investors there. And if I recall it correctly, I think originally people were driving, the founders were driving for high valuation for the early rounds of funding. And then, that means you get certain investors, others might not come on board. And in that case, I think, the company went through different down rounds, up rounds, and so forth. So it didn't matter perhaps as much as people thought what exactly, to getting the highest possible early valuation over the life cycle. But Rob, you might have different perspectives on that.
Yeah, my stories are less venture and more investment banking side of things. But you would often find mismatches between, what the company was articulating to the public and what was happening behind the scenes. I remember, I think it was in the Time Warner building, AOL was getting acquired. And the Inquisitor and the company came up with completely different visions of the future right in a row in 2001. But I've seen a number of boom bust cycles. I sat down the hall from Mary Meeker. She was one of the preeminent internet analysts back in the early .com boom. And we saw everything just, go up precipitously and then crash. And I did structured finance and asset-backed securities as well, even before. And that didn't come to a screaming halt until 2008. So when you look at these markets, when you look at capital, it's really about pricing risk. And the answer is always, even in the stock market, right? Like that if you have a high beta stock, a high volatility stock, in general, it'll perform better, but it'll be really choppy and messy along the way. And so if you're a venture capitalist, you may invest in 50 deals and hope that 2 of them are massive winners and 48 crash and burn. That's very different than if you buy, T-bills that give you 4% a year. So we see people, I think, at the edge of risk, making calculated bets and understanding that in some cases failure is likely, but hopefully they're allocating funds and human effort to things that will be productive in the world in a massive way.
Wow. Well, the fact that you were around for the AOL, some people listening to this may not know what AOL is.
Well, it's old school. Exactly.
Yeah. And Shazam too as well. I was around for the .com boom and bust, and I certainly hopped on that train as well in New York.
Hopefully the boom side.
Oh, yeah. And I love the boom side because I got really good at ping pong, foosball, and billiards, I gotta say. Because we had a gaming room at Double Click and arcade games, and we had, this is the beginnings of free soda at the office, and a basketball court in the middle of West 33rd on the rooftop. Amazing. So now what we're seeing, like I've seen, and like NVIDIA just through the roof and any kind of AI play. What are you guys seeing about the similarities between, that whole era, which was an amazing era to go through? I loved it. But like now we're in this era. What are the similarities and differences?
Well, we're not going to know until afterward. But I think ahead of time, we can speculate based on the past, which is that there are definitively aspects of pricing and funding that are bubble-esque. And that's fine. That's in the natural order of things. I think the questions that we need to ask as people, and questions you need to ask, as a human being trying to navigate the world, are what is this going to do for my life? Like, who cares about a bunch of like ex hedge fund guys like myself betting one way or the other on which companies succeed and fail, when at the end of it, we got wild technology we'd never heard of. And I think we're going to see the same thing now, which is there's going to be a lot of, what Schumpeter called creative destruction, and things will boom, bust, fail, succeed. And coming out at the end of it, we'll have clarity. But the only clarity we have now is that we don't have clarity.
I would say, I prefer to work with companies, both with Project Net and as an angel investor and so forth, that address real problems that will, continue it. They're not as much subject to boom and bust cycles, but also a team that is financially somewhat cautious and reasonable and not likely, because it's easy to spend, to waste money during the dot-com time. So I think a founders team that addresses a real need, is really passionate about that, and financially sort of responsible, I think that makes it much more resilient no matter, what happens.
What if you had a founder who's just like, Steve Jobs, for example, is he's a visionary and maybe he wasn't the easiest person to deal with. But when you encounter somebody who, let's say, isn't any sort of norm, I mean, I'm sure there's different kinds of founders. How do you interact with them and find like common ground or ways to work with them? Because I'm sure there's just so many different types, and you kind of have to really have a PhD in that alone, is dealing with a visionary or eccentric CTO or...
And often we deal with PhDs and most of the time, super smart founders and so forth, particularly in deep tech, where, they're just way smarter than we are. But I think what you want to do is what I'm trying to do is to focus on the substance of what they're trying to achieve. And that's something that they're passionate about. And, at that point, then the personality starts to matter less. If you have a relationship with them that has trust built in, you trust each other, you can be open with each other. And then, the personality, I think, matters a little bit less.
Okay, well, let's shift gears. What do you guys think overall about AI happening in Asia versus the West? Is there more interest now, obviously, because of DeepSeek? Is that kind of picking up? What's the temperature?
I'm super excited about Asia. I wouldn't want to go back, as much as I love the bagels in New York, I wouldn't want to move back to Europe or to the US at this stage. In terms of AI and tech, so you find many countries where there is, a young population that is hungry, that feels emboldened and sort of encouraged by what's happening in the West, like Elon Musk and various other people that just make amazing things happen, and people want to do the same here or better. So we find, particularly in places like Korea, for example, Korea has always been for me like, I don't know, it's not the right way to describe it, like a black hole where there's like really fascinating stuff happening, but it somehow doesn't get out. In fact, that was when I remember when I was working at Shazam, I was doing international business development back in 2002 or so. I was in Seoul and I came back to London to talk to the Shazam team and said, I've been in a time machine. I was in the future. I was in Korea, and there people have, 100 megabit per second internet connection. They sit, in comfortable chairs in these internet cafes and play games. This was at a time when in London you could get, 2 or 3 megabit per second internet connection. So it was always, much more advanced. And what we're seeing now, we found some really amazing AI that has been developed by Korean companies, by very young founders, actually, super smart. They have already customers in Korea. That's the other thing. In Korea, you find, lots of, particularly in heavy industry and consumer electronics, you find amazing customers. These sort of young founders of startups using AI have already traction in Korea. So that's kind of one thing that is, pretty unique to Asia. And what we're doing is we're helping them, to come out of this black hole, find international customers and so forth. And the first reaction has been amazing. So that's kind of Korea is one interesting area for me. Then obviously in Singapore and Hong Kong, you find very vibrant startup systems and ecosystems. Block 71 here in Singapore, Science Park in Hong Kong. So you find an amazing community of startups that are really hungry and ambitious and very smart, particularly these days, with some of, these AI models being open source. It's much easier for people to access technology than it was probably, 20 years ago. And then you have, young countries like Vietnam, for example, where you have a large and young population that, is increasing getting involved in smarter manufacturing, where I think, you see the nascent development of startups and interesting things. So then, of course, you have, Japan with different, so there are just so many fascinating reasons, I think, for regions here and countries that develop, really interesting AI-based startup ideas. So I'm pretty enthusiastic about the region here.
Yeah, I mean, within this region with so many, you have Southeast Asia and Singapore and Taiwan, and they're all different cultures and different behaviors. Are you seeing any kind of unified commonality in terms of the utilization or culture?
Well, I think the culture, on the if you have just B2C business, consumer focused thing, then I think the cultural differences and the economic difference and so forth, matter. The small, what you call these sari stores in the Philippines, that's different from what you find in Singapore, Hong Kong, or Taiwan. But, if you look at the infrastructure, AI software, things like payment systems and, various other things, that matters much less. So one of the companies I'm involved is out of Hong Kong, actually. They use AI and evolutionary genetic algorithms to discover new material that doesn't exist today for space radiation shielding. So this is kind of, something that, in fact, they have some grants from the European Space Agency already. It's a great example that is totally independent of, what's happening. Just happens to come out of Hong Kong in this particular case. So I think if you look at the consumer side, yes, the differences matter much more. I think commonalities are still, social networking. I think that's also a global phenomenon. But if you look at the B2B or the infrastructure side, then I think the regional differences matter much less, I would say.
Robert, what do you think, like, let's say, for example, people in Silicon Valley or people in, I want to say Silicon Alley for us New Yorkers.
Sure.
How do they view Asia?
In terms of technology, I think fundamentally technology wants to be free, right? That's true whether you're in one geography or another, whether you have patent protection or you don't, whether it's open source or it's not. You wind up seeing, everything that was in Xerox PARC became your mouse, became, Steve Jobs's operating system, and that, Windows went from one computer to another and now they're everywhere. So I think that's the backbone. Ultimately, this all will become diffuse, and it's only the rules of man, the rules of, nations that are constraining that. All that said, we have to understand that this is in every sense an arms race, right? That these are important technologies that will change the landscape of the future. And as such, countries will be protective of, their infrastructure to create it, whether that infrastructure is mines, whether that infrastructure is fabs. So this will become a touchstone for a lot of presumably geopolitical friction in the coming era. In the near term, however, like the capital guys, they just want to make money, and the scientists just want to make cooler toys.
How does a company stay Switzerland, let's say, for example?
Klaus is closer.
Actually, Singapore is a great example. Singapore is, very small country, but, has become very wealthy, very sophisticated. And there are key challenges, as, Lee Hsien Loong and others would say. So they want to stay friends with the US and the West. And they also want to stay and think they should with China. So I think there will be, countries like Switzerland that will manage to be friends with both and very rational and, avoid getting too involved in any of the conflict. They don't want to take sides, I think. And hopefully, nobody will be forced to do that.
I mean, without changing governments, how can Hong Kong be better? More like Singapore? Or how can Singapore be more like Hong Kong? Whichever way you want to take it.
I think Hong Kong is also a great example of, a relatively neutral place, no matter what people say. But from a pure business perspective, you can set up a company in Hong Kong that could have Chinese investors and still do business in the West. So I think Hong Kong is an interesting territory as well.
There's such a longer conversation. We could definitely deep dive. You both have like super interesting bios. Robert, I want to ask you about your rock climbing.
Yeah, I was a skinny little kid in the middle of nowhere, and my father was a military guy, an ex-military guy. We used to go climbing. My mother would cover her eyes. But the guy that I learned rock climbing from, you call it a pitch, is a rope length. So when you're lead climbing, which means that you're building the rope on the way up, you're moored to the mountain, and when you fall twice as far if you're lucky. But there's nobody on the ground or the top who's like stopping your fall. So we were 7 ropes up on the side of a mountain, and that's when I learned that the guy was a hemophiliac and the teacher. And my father was like, well, that means he's careful. So
I like your dad. I like your dad.
Cool. Everybody did.
Tell me more. I mean, I feel like that's something, climbing a mountain is not for everybody. Let's put it that way. Why that? Other than, I know.
Because I was young and dumb, I guess. I mean, it might have, I'm trying to remember. There's a, why'd you do it? Because it was there. I don't know if that was Edmund Hillary or not, but I think at least for my dad, there was a combination of risk, which is stimulating, right? Whether it's controlled risk because you're laughing in a movie theater, or whether it's, playing a shooter and feeling like you're at war, that I think there's something to being under stress and then having success under stress that maps to the human condition, right? If you're really good at something and you're playing it with somebody who's terrible, it's not any fun. At least for him, it was kind of him versus the world and trying to push boundaries, because if you're not pushing boundaries, you're not making progress and you're not having fun. He was intense. I'm less so.
Like by this much or like
No, no, like by a lot, by several rope lengths.
Wow, that's really cool. I mean, yeah, and the rock climbing, like, are you one that goes to like Yosemite or something?
Well, the crazy thing is that I think the kids who are in rock walls these days are probably better technically than I was because
Mhm.
it's very controlled circumstances and you get the blue hand grab. Like there's a whole pile of different grabs in the wall and they take the blue route. And if you're climbing, very, very seriously, you're doing it even harder on purpose. In our case, it was just get the hell up, like figure out a way to get to the top of the mountain. And that worked for me as a little kid.
I'm sure there's so much more, but Klaus, I want to hear about how you stuck a landing flying
Yeah.
low altitude. Please tell people the story about, this.
Yeah, so I can talk about how I fly ultralight airplanes, which are basically like a go-kart with wings with a little Rotax, 60, 70 horsepower engine on the back, but for two people, but you sit in the open, basically. With that, I fly typically really slow and low, as slow as 25 miles an hour, which for an airplane is not very fast. And one day I was flying actually with a friend of mine who is pretty heavy. So we did some video filming and so forth. So I didn't really pay attention to the gasoline because you don't have an instrument that shows you how much you have left. You just have sort of this triangular tank, fuel tank that you can look at. And then, of course, because of that shape, it goes slowly initially and then it goes pretty fast. And somehow I hadn't paid enough attention. We were over the field at 900 feet. And to add to the situation, there was a big RC festival happening. So remote controlled airplanes. They had 150 remote controlled airplanes flying at the flying club. And we had agreed then if they would hear me coming, they would stop that and I would then come in and land. So right when we were on top of the airfield and went into the bank, into the turn, the engine stopped because it was out of fuel. And that was entirely my fault because I was supposed to pay attention to that. And then sort of what kicked in was really a strange calm. I realized, okay, no more power. So I have to land this airplane as a glider plane. I guess it could have gone two ways, but I was not overcome by fear and panic. So something in my brain said, oh, that's interesting. That sounds like fun. Let's give it a try. And I did what I had practiced before. You sort of spiral. You don't fly far away because then you might make a mistake not coming in. So you sort of spiral into the field until, you just land like a glider plane and nothing happened. It was perfectly peaceful. But it was interesting to see how sort of my brain luckily, reacted in that way in that situation. It was fun.
Cool and calm under pressure. Wow. Well, I want to ask you guys for younger people who are maybe in the teenage years who are looking to be like, hey, I want to do what Robert does. I want to do what Klaus does. Like, what should they be looking at in this kind of like new future that we're entering into? How can they prepare themselves?
Yeah, I think that's tricky because if I looked at every sort of parents' generation would have followed the advice, would have been totally wrong. I would be working in some bank branch in Hamburg probably if I would have followed, what my mother thought was important at the time. So I think the one advice would be to ignore any advice that comes from your parents or from older people trying to give you advice because it's bound to be wrong. And that was, true, I think, many decades ago. It's even more true today. Who knows? So I think my advice just would be similar to, I think, what Steve Jobs and others have said. Do what you're passionate about. Mm-hmm. Follow your instincts. And because that's the highest likelihood, I think, to be good at something, if that's something that you enjoy, that would be kind of have fun. Then, the rest will follow, I think.
Was there a crossroads when you were like, at that age? How were you thinking about like?
I always liked computers. So in high school, we had a deal computer with little tapes of paper with holes in it. That's how we were programming, the early computers. And I've always, for some reason, I always found it fascinating, so that you could make a machine do something, this feeling of control and complexity you could generate. So for me, programming was always fun. And, that's what I did then in the business context and others later more sort of on a strategic level. But I think it's, in my case, it was something that I just enjoyed playing with. Still do.
And Robert?
I mean, Klaus gives great advice, which is, don't listen to Klaus's advice. But
exactly.
So I agree in principle. I think that if you were to pick one thing, it would be malleability. It would be, as a human being, the capability to navigate a variety of different stressful situations, a variety of different challenges, but not necessarily saying, hey, I'm going to be an accountant because the robots will do that for you. So my gut is that this might be a jack of all trades future. But again, don't listen to me.
Okay. Well, no, that's to really diversify in your knowledge. Sounds like something. I do many things. So whether that helped me in the future or not, we shall see, right? There'll be clarity. I want to thank you guys for coming out on the show. Certainly would love to have you back. I think AI is just changing so rapidly. So I'm sure we'll need your advice. Great.
Awesome.
I'm going to let you
thank
guys
you,
go.
sir. I appreciate
Thank
your
you
time.
too. Thank you, Klaus. And
See you guys.
yeah, we'll talk again.
Sounds good.
You got
Have a
it.
good day. Take care,
Thanks.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.